Penguin Random House Audio presents See Jane Win, the inspiring story of the women changing American politics. This is the author, Caitlin Moscatello. For all the girls looking up. Women in this country must become revolutionaries. We must refuse to accept the traditional roles and stereotypes. We must replace the old negative thoughts about our femininity with positive thoughts and positive action, affirming it, and more. But we must also remember that we will be breaking with tradition, and so we must prepare ourselves educationally, economically, and psychologically in order that we will be able to accept and bear with the sanctions that society will immediately impose upon us. Shirley Chisholm. Introduction. My now husband and I took our engagement photos on November 8, 2016, the same day that the first woman would be elected President of the United States. Or so I and millions of others thought. In the images, I'm beaming, still high off what I'd witnessed that morning at the polls. I'd arrived at 5:45 a.m. to find a line already wrapped around a corner of my New York City neighborhood, excited voters clutching coffees in the dark and talking about what a thrilling and historic day it was going to be. I kept my cool until I looked over and locked eyes with an older woman in a cream-colored pantsuit. She smiled and nodded at me, and I nodded back, a mutual "I got you." I was confident in the polling data, almost all of which pointed to a Hillary Clinton victory. I was confident in our country. Donald Trump had been so hateful, so disgusting as a candidate. I believed that a Clinton victory was all but a sure thing. In the photos, I am wearing the expression of someone not only in love, but also certain she's about to witness history. What a brief, magical time. You don't need me to tell you how things played out. Like many of the women I spoke with during the course of writing this book, I didn't sleep that night. Instead, with puffy eyes and a lot of carbohydrates, I spent the early hours of November 9th emailing the editors I work with as a freelance journalist, trying to make sense of what had happened. Everyone was awake. Everyone was in a fog. Texts and emails changed from grasping onto any thread of hope to serious conversations about our new reality. A Trump presidency was upon us. What would it mean? How would we make sense of all of this so quickly? The first weeks after the election were, to put it bluntly, bleak. And that was the view from the admittedly cushy perch of a college-educated white woman living in a liberal city. I was sad, but I was not scared, at least not for myself. I was not a dreamer who now feared deportation. I was not suddenly at risk of losing my health care or the health care of my child. Trump's hardest punches would likely swish past me, but they had the potential to land squarely on millions of other people, including people I loved, and that made me angry and raw in a way I hadn't experienced before. It wasn't just who had won either. It was what had won. Racism, sexism, ignorance, intolerance. As women, we saw for the first time one of our own poised to take the presidency. And then we watched that same competent, qualified woman who had done what we've all been told since girlhood: work hard, play by the rules, move up the ladder rung by splintering rung, defeated by a misogynistic narcissist known to many Americans as a reality TV star. It was as if an ice-cold bucket of water had been dumped over our heads. Not only would we not get the first female president, we would be forced to watch a man who bragged about sexually assaulting women take her place. I wondered how women across the country would react to the Trump administration, which had the potential to push its agenda forward with few backstops, thanks to a GOP-controlled House and Senate. I was also desperate to find a bright spot in the mess we were in, any thread of optimism to grab onto and squeeze tight. The country had been handed over to a bunch of mostly old, mostly white, conservative men. Progressive women would rise up, but how high? They'd speak out, but how loud? Was all that talk about pussy grabs back the stuff of hashtags and memes, or was there real bite behind the growl? I had tons of questions and almost no answers, but one of the few things I was certain of was that without more women in office, our rights would continue to be at risk. I started thinking about power. who gets it and when and why. And I started thinking about what it really meant that even in 2017, women made up only about 1/5 of Congress and roughly a quarter of state legislatures and statewide executive offices. It wasn't clear then that this was the shining light I'd been searching for, but I was compelled to follow it. I made calls to groups that train women to run for office, which led to conversations with potential candidates. It was so early, very few had decided if they would definitely run. But I realized quickly how compelling these women were. Conversations where I'd requested, "Just a few minutes of your time, thanks so much," often lasted over an hour. And I would hang up the phone feeling energized. Something was happening, something bigger than a march or a protest. A few weeks later, I told my agent that I had an idea for a book, and it was either going to be a really inspiring or really depressing story, and I wouldn't know which until Election Day 2018. I also wouldn't know at the outset who the main characters would be because there was no way to predict who would make it onto the ballot. It sounds crazy in hindsight, and yet that's the very book you're about to listen to. In the almost 2 years I spent reporting this story, the feeling that women were so much further from equality than we thought had remained deeply palpable among candidates and voters alike. It was not uncommon for women to tear up recalling election night or pause to take a breath, telling me what it felt like watching Clinton's concession speech. The pain spanned generations. A young woman in Philadelphia, who was 27 at the time, recalled staring out the car window the morning after the election and seeing a distraught woman waiting for a bus. "I just fell apart," she said. "People looked like zombies." Something about looking at this woman and thinking about how messed up everyone was from what happened, it was just so disturbing. And I knew I looked the same way. We were all fucked up from it. A pro-choice activist in her 70s put it to me this way. It felt like someone had died. And something did die, you know? A feeling died. We know now that Clinton's loss, however devastating, signaled a beginning rather than an end. Instead of wallowing passively, women were moved to act, and one of their first impulses was to reach for their wallets. In the 6 weeks after the election, Planned Parenthood received more than 300,000 donations, roughly 40 times its normal rate, most of which came from first-time donors. The ACLU experienced a similar bump. The day after the election, its donation page crashed thanks to a 7,000% increase in traffic. And by the end of the year, the organization also reported receiving roughly 300,000 donations to the tune of almost $23 million in online contributions alone. Such acts of resistance started small, a few dollars here, a phone call to a representative there. But as January approached, it was clear that the discontent that had been heating up since November had reached full boil. In just 2 months after Trump was elected president, millions of people in 60 countries and on all continents, including, impressively, Antarctica, came out for the Global Women's March. The show of solidarity, not just with women, but with immigrants, people of color, the LGBTQ community, and more, became one of the biggest single-day demonstrations in recorded U.S. history. The message to the Trump administration was clear. We're not going to stand for what you represent. But the message to women was perhaps even clearer. If we banded together, if we showed up for each other, we were a force. Not long after the Women's March came the first rumblings that something big was happening on the political front. Groups training women to run for office reported an unprecedented spike in interest from potential candidates, including some of the same women I'd been speaking with in those phone calls. Leaders of several of these groups, who you'll meet throughout this book, told me that in a typical year, getting women signed up was an uphill battle, one that took relentless recruiting efforts. University of Virginia professor Jennifer Lawless, Ph.D., a leading researcher and expert on women in politics, explained that it had historically been difficult to get women to run for office. The two biggest barriers are that women are less likely than men to be recruited or encouraged to run for office, and that women are less likely than men, even when they look exactly the same on paper, to consider themselves qualified to run for office, she told me. In one study conducted by Lawless and Richard L. Fox, a political science professor at Loyola Marymount University, it was found that women overestimated how much gender bias they'd face while campaigning.